Imagine this. You're an indigenous person in Mexico, a descendant of the proud Mayan people, and you live in a small rural community in Chiapas. And you're at home with your children one evening when the police arrive and demand entrance. Now, you don't speak very much Spanish, only your own indigenous language, so you can't understand what the police are saying. They kick in the door and arrest you. And you have enough time to tell your children to go to a trusted neighbor's house. They take you to the police station, and they don't let you contact anyone, so your family doesn't know where you are. The police sit you down, and they take a document that you can't read, and they put it on the table in front of you and make it clear you're expected to sign. You know the police have translators available, but there are none in the room. So you refuse to sign the document. And you're taken to a darkened cell, and you're beaten and maybe sexually abused. And you're left alone in that cell without food or water for 2 days. Finally, fearing for your life, you agree to sign the document. You've just signed a confession to a murder. And without a trial, you're given 30 years in prison. There's nothing unusual about the scenario I've just outlined. The indigenous people of Chiapas have been fighting for justice for 5 centuries. For them, the legacy of the Spanish conquest manifests today as poverty, racism, and injustice. Their human rights are under constant assault. Now, I'm both a scholar and an advocate of human rights. So in July 2019, I traveled to Chiapas to meet with victims of police abuse and judicial injustice. And a human rights organization called CIPAS facilitated interviews with both victims and activists. And I promised my interviewees that I would amplify their voices as much as I could. Chiapas is the southernmost state of Mexico, home to 1.2 million indigenous people, about 1/3 of the state's residents. Now, the indigenous folks there don't get much of a childhood. Poverty forces them to work from a young age, which means they also don't get too much formal education and don't learn too much Spanish. They grow up speaking their own indigenous language at home. And this is one reason why they're so susceptible to police abuse. They can't understand what the police are saying. They don't know their rights under the law. The law requires the police to provide translators, but they rarely do. Furthermore, their poverty means the indigenous often can't hire a lawyer to protect them in court. And also, there's a lot of racism against the indigenous in Mexico. They're often considered expendable. And this is why Mexican prisons are full of poor people and very often indigenous ones. Injustice in Chiapas typically begins with arbitrary arrest. Now, an arrest is considered arbitrary if it has no legitimate legal basis. There's several reasons why police would do this. They may be trying to extort a bribe out of someone, pay up and we'll let you go, regardless of whether or not they think they're guilty. Or maybe police got the guilty party who paid him a bribe and was released. But the police have to bring somebody in for that crime, so the police need a fall guy. Somebody who can't speak Spanish, somebody who can't pay a lawyer, somebody expendable. And police corruption in Mexico is out of control. A 2020 report by Human Rights Watch called Mexican police infamous for their corruption. And police torture to secure a confession is so widespread and so well known that according to Amnesty International, 64% of Mexican citizens say they fear torture by their own police. When I arrived in Chiapas in July 2019, Chiapas facilitated a visit to an infamous prison outside of San Cristobal de las Casas. And there I met 10 men who had formed together to protest against their arbitrary arrest and conditions in the prison. And conditions in that prison were bad. I remember during the interview, we had flies crawling all over us. And the men told me that they had all been in prison before between 8 and 20 years on sentences that were as long as 29 years. All told me that they were innocent of the charges against them. The only reason they were in prison was because they were indigenous and couldn't afford a lawyer. They'd all been railroaded. They also complained of a lack of food in the prison, saying that their families had to provide much of it. And their families don't have much to spare. They also complained that the guards regularly beat anybody who protested, for example, for their right to a translator. And the group's leader was Pedro Jimenez. Now, Jimenez was the most experienced one at prison activism, and he told me that the hunger strikes that he had organized had succeeded in getting some of the men released from the prison, and they'd also pressured the prison authorities into providing more food and better medical attention for the prisoners. Now, this group, and groups like them, are supported by organizations outside the prison, such as No Estamos Todos, which do public protests to try to generate public pressure on the prison authorities. The prison authorities were not happy with Jimenez. He told me that he'd been beaten and pepper sprayed many times to break his will, and nothing has dissuaded him. I also visited the women's block in the prison. Now, sexual abuse of women in prison in Mexico is rampant. But one of the women I interviewed told me that the worst part of her experience was that she had not been able to see her children grow up. Also, there's a terrible social stigma in Mexico against a woman who's been in prison, so that even when she's released, her family and friends often ostracize her. She can't get a job. No one will rent her an apartment. Luckily, there's an outstanding organization in San Cristobal de las Casas called the Cereza Collective. And the Cereza Collective helps women while they're in prison by giving them material and legal assistance. And also when the women get out of prison, with giving them a place to live, helping them get a job, and maybe reconnecting them with their family. I also, in the same prison, met 4 men who were on a hunger strike, and they called themselves the Voice of Indigenous Resistance. When I met them, they had been on this hunger strike for 114 days, living on nothing but water and honey. And they were living in this makeshift tent on the lawn next to the prison hospital, because at that point they were in very poor health. They were risking their lives at this point, and they needed to be close to the medical facility. In fact, when I interviewed them, they were all wrapped up in blankets despite the July heat because their bodies could no longer produce heat. And they told me that they were doing this hunger strike to protest their arbitrary arrest, that they were innocent of the charges but had been given 25 years each. They also told me they had all been savagely beaten by the guards because of their protests. They said that they bore the scars of torture on their body as evidence of this. And it seemed like their hunger strike had the desired effect. It had generated public pressure because a district judge announced that he was reviewing their cases. And on August 20th, 2019, the judge announced the findings of his review. Not only was he not releasing them, he was extending their sentences from 25 to 50 years. And the men put out a public statement saying the reason why he had done this was because they had refused to pay him a bribe, and this was their punishment. The indigenous people of Chiapas have been fighting for justice for centuries. Through the Mexican Revolution, through the Zapatista uprising of 1994, the struggle continues now through nonviolent means. Because anytime you see injustice, you will also see certain people who stand up to resist as well as they can. In such certain circumstances, normal people can become heroes. I got to meet some of them. You can help them if you choose to. Nothing I've said in this talk is a secret. And a quick Google search on fighting injustice in Chiapas would reveal a wealth of information for you to act on. And feel invited to act. This is dark stuff, I know, but better to light one candle than curse the darkness. Thank you.